Okay, good afternoon. We are here for the sixth interview of our series. The title is Free Thought from the Future, with Professor Robert Pindyck from the Sloan School of Management at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thank you very much, Robert, to be here with us. So we start our interview. So I start with the first question. So the first one is about net zero emission. Do you think it is possible to pursue the net zero emission target by 2050?
Well, as I said before, I think it's extremely unlikely that we will meet a net zero emission target. I mean, we can talk about it, we can make it a target, but we're not going to reach it. And I think we have to be realistic about that. We're simply not doing enough. The world is not doing enough. And, Europe is doing the most. If you look at Europe and you look at CO2 emissions in Europe and the UK, I'm going to include the UK with Europe, it's doing the most and it's reducing emissions. I don't even think, however, that Europe will reach net zero by 2050, although it may come close. The US is doing much less right now. There's almost no chance the United States will reach net zero. And then you look at Asia, you look at not just Asia, but also Russia, Brazil, some of these large countries, Africa, and then you have Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, of course, China, Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on. Their emissions are increasing and are likely to continue to increase over the next 10 years. There's just no way that we can realistically expect those countries to even come close to net zero by 2050. So there's nothing wrong with a target. There's nothing wrong with saying we should try to reach net zero. But we have to be realistic about what's going to happen. We're not going to reach net zero. It's just exceedingly unlikely that we'll reach net zero. And so we have to think about what that means. What are we going to do if indeed that's the case?
Okay. So now we would like to speak about more in depth about also adaptation and mitigation as this action in order to reduce CO2 emission and so on. So you have written a book on this, the title Climate Future, Averting and Adapting to Climate Change, in which is possible to read about mitigation. Also, it is possible to maintain the temperature under the target. This is possible to reach, which is the probability to reach the target or to maintain the temperature under this ceiling, and also which are also the other action in order to be prepared in order to a possible increase of temperature. So the question is related to this, is focusing on the fight against climate change. What is your opinion about mitigation versus adaptation strategies? Should there be a perfect balance between the two, or should we prioritize one of them?
Well, I talk quite a bit about this in the book. The book is called Climate Future, Averting and Adapting to Climate Change. And in the book, I explain that almost all of the emphasis right now is on mitigation, reducing emissions. That's almost everything we're doing is reducing emissions. And that's good. That's nice. That's wonderful. But we have to be realistic. And, there's what we want to do and should do and what we will do. And as I said in answer to your previous question, realistically, emissions are going to continue to increase globally over the next decade. We're not going to reach net zero in the next 30 years. And that means that it's likely, we can't be certain, but it's likely that temperatures will continue to increase and that the global mean temperature increase will be greater than the 2-degree limit that climate scientists have said is serious, that limit. It's quite likely, quite possible that the temperature increase in the next 30, 40, 50 years could reach 3 degrees Celsius or even more. We don't know, but it's possible and in fact likely. And that means that we have to think about what we're going to do in that situation. And that's where adaptation comes in. Excuse me. So if we expect the temperature to increase, we ask, well, what would that do? What would the impact of that be? Would it cause, for example, would sea levels increase? and by how much? Would it lead to flooding? We don't know what would happen to sea levels. There's a huge amount of disagreement, but it's certainly possible that we will see an increase in sea levels and an increase in the frequency and severity of hurricanes. And that could indeed mean that we will see flooding in low-lying areas, in countries like Bangladesh, Thailand, but also in cities like New York, Manhattan, which you might remember during Hurricane Sandy, southern Manhattan got flooded. So we need to do adaptation. We need to adapt to that possibility. And that might mean building seawalls and dikes. Much of the Netherlands is below sea level. If the Netherlands had not developed its dike system, the Dutch system of dikes, it would be underwater. And so we need to think about doing those kinds of actions to reduce the chance of flooding. Let me mention one form of adaptation that's very controversial and that environmentalists don't like. And that is climate engineering, atmospheric engineering. What you do is you inject into the atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, particles of sulfur or sulfur dioxide, which combines with water to create a haze of sulfuric acid. And what that does is it doesn't get rid of carbon dioxide, but what it does is it blocks the greenhouse effect. It prevents much of the warming effect of carbon dioxide. So this kind of geological engineering, this kind of radiation management, injecting sulfur particles, is something that is controversial because it does not deal with the buildup of CO2, does not deal with the possibility of ocean acidification. Many environmentalists don't like doing anything to change what's in the atmosphere, but it's something that we need to think about and get ready to use should we face an impending catastrophe, climate catastrophe. So that's an example of something that we need to do work on, we need to think about. And I talk a lot about this in the book and explain how that would be done and what kinds of activities we would need to do now to get ready. So in the book, I talk about a variety of things that fall under this general area of adaptation. Seawalls and averting flooding is one example. Geoengineering is another example, but there are others. And I think that, again, it's not a question of do 50-50, should we have equal amounts? We do what we can to reduce emissions, but we have to be realistic and expect that there's a good chance we're not going to meet the targets that we're talking about. And therefore, we have to start working on adaptation and do much more than we're doing right now.
Okay, thank you very much. So the third question is more about other problems. Is also related to, this series is called Free Thoughts on the Future. We're speaking about the future. I studied a lot on one of your book. This book was written about investment under uncertainty, looking at the future. And for me, it's very, very famous because I studied on this, and so my research started on this. And in this book, we are speaking about uncertainty. In your new book, that is also very important for also this topic we are speaking about, you are speaking about climate future. So we are looking about climate change, the future, and uncertainty. So the thing is to ask which are other elements related to the future. So the question is, which issues other than climate change would you prioritize for our future? For example, inequality, less developed countries, space economy, or bioethics. Which is?
Well, look, there are many things that are going to come up in the future, some of which involve ethical decisions, political decisions, many things. And, we can now clone animals, and presumably, if we wanted to, we could probably clone a human being. Is that ethical? I'm not going to give an opinion on that because that's not my expertise. But it's clearly something that we'll have to be worried about and think about in the future. I would say one thing about something like that, and that is related to nuclear weapons, because one of the biggest fears that I have is the possibility of nuclear war, which is becoming more and more real and more problematic as proliferation of nuclear weapons grows. And that is that if you look at history, what you see is that when people can do something, when they're able to do something, they will do it. If countries are able to create nuclear weapons, they will. I think that if societies are able to clone, whether it's animals or people, eventually they will, just because they can. That's just my own thought about what is likely to happen. But in terms of what we ought to worry about, my concern is global catastrophes, potential global catastrophes. This is something I've written about quite a bit in the last 5 or 8 years. And how do we think about averting catastrophes? And what do I mean by global catastrophes? I mean things that could affect the entire world and have a severe impact on world GDP, welfare around the world, and so on. So a pandemic is a good example of that. The Spanish flu of 1918 wiped out, killed close to 4% of the population of Europe and the United States. It was devastating, much worse than the COVID pandemic that we've been dealing with in the last 2 years. And if you look at what the biologists and virologists are saying, including the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, their reports, the development, these new viruses are very likely to arise. And they could be much worse than the COVID pandemic that we're dealing with now. So we need to do much more. I think the world needs to do much more to ameliorate future pandemics. That's just one example of something. And, climate change, of course, could be a catastrophic thing in the future. But here's something that I think is even more likely, and that is nuclear terrorism. I think it's quite likely that we will see in the next 20, 30 years, terrorists getting a hold of a Hiroshima-grade nuclear weapon and setting it off in one or more large cities in the US or Europe or somewhere else in the world. That would be devastating. It would be devastating not just because of the event itself, it could kill hundreds of thousands of people, but because of what it would do to the global economy. It would have a devastating impact on the global economy. And then there's bioterrorism, because, terrible viruses can arise on their own. For example, the way COVID did, or the way the Spanish flu did, but they can also be engineered. And as we get better and better at engineering harmful viruses and bacteria, terrorists can use that technology to engineer bad things, bad microorganisms that could spread and create havoc. And we don't do anything about that. We don't talk about that. We don't like to think about those things. These are not things that are happy to talk about. And people don't talk about it. So right now, the news is mostly about climate. That's fine. It's important. To a secondary extent, it's about pandemics, but not enough. We don't worry enough about it. We're not doing enough. And there's almost no discussion, very little, about nuclear terrorism, bioterrorism, nuclear proliferation, the chance of nuclear war. These things, cyber attacks, cyber warfare, I could go on. You can use your imagination. These things don't get the attention that climate is getting. And that's unfortunate, because I think the world has to be ready for other terrible things that are global in nature and could easily occur in the next 20, 30 years.
Okay, thank you very much. About this, I have 2 questions. So the first one is about catastrophes. What we can do. So I understand there is no information on this, no debate on this. This only solution is only adaptation. So we have to adapt also on this, nuclear terrorism and so on. this is our possible reaction, or we can do from the political point of view, which could be a manner more, less individual and more in group, if there is a possibility. I don't know. But with respect to catastrophes, what we can do? What can we do?
Let me give you an example. Let's talk about nuclear terrorism. How would that happen? It would happen because once somebody gets high-grade uranium, highly enriched U-235, enriched to 80, 90%, they can make a bomb very easy. So anybody with good engineering or physics backgrounds, if they were given the enriched uranium, could create a bomb, all right? The real problem is enriching the uranium. That's what we worry about what's happening in Iran. We worry about the enrichment, that they're enriching uranium to a high degree. So let's suppose terrorists got a hold of enriched uranium. They bought it from North Korea. They bought it somewhere else. They did it themselves. Somehow they got the enriched uranium and they create a bomb. What would they do? Well, first of all, they could, we talked about North Korea sending a missile. They don't need to send a missile. All they need is a boat, a fishing boat. Put the bomb on a boat, bring the boat in near the United States to the West Coast and set it off. That's all they have to do. So what we need to do is gather much, much more intelligence. We need to find out much more about what's going on. We need to do much more to intervene, find out where uranium is being enriched and stop it. That might mean military action. That might mean tracking shipments of enriched uranium in order to prevent the kinds of terrible catastrophic events that I'm talking about. We're not doing enough right now. We're doing very little in this regard, and we need to do much more. So that's one example. Another example is pandemics. What do we do about pandemics? Well, one thing we can do is set up the infrastructure, set up the mechanisms to create new vaccines, rather than wait for the new virus, or, for example, monkeypox, this new thing that people are talking about. Yes. Rather than wait for the next pandemic, for a new virus or bacteria, start now to build up the resources to quickly create vaccines rather than have it delayed. Have everything in place so we can react quickly and produce many millions, hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine quickly. We're not doing that. That costs money, and the payoff is uncertain because we don't know when the next pandemic will occur. But there's something we should be doing to prevent the impact of another pandemic. So those are examples.
Okay. About the future, another idea that I have in mind is so looking at the technology. Maybe the technology could help us for the energy transition. No, the learning curve about the cost, the production cost for photovoltaic, wind energy, and so on are declining. So they can help us in order to substitute fossil fuels, even if we have a strong problem related to capacity. This is my point of view. In the technologies, there is also nuclear fusion. And I don't know, maybe it could help if we were able. Obviously, it depends on the probability to be a success to obtain a success in this new technology. Which is your opinion about this for the future? So,
yeah, I would forget about fusion. So I'll mention to you, many years ago when I was an undergraduate, it was a long time ago, I actually studied physics, and I had planned to go to graduate school and study plasma physics, the physics of controlled nuclear fusion. I'm very glad I didn't, because economics is more fun, and because fusion has gone nowhere, and it's something that's completely hypothetical. I'm talking about controlled fusion, not bombs. So it is extremely, extremely hypothetical at this point. It's not something that we're going to have available in the next 20 years, almost for sure. And we already have the technology for nuclear power, fission technology. And we now are developing much better, cheaper, safer nuclear reactors. And that's what we need. And by the way, this is also something I discuss in the book, nuclear, the use of nuclear power. We're going to have to use nuclear power. If we want to decarbonize the electricity sector, we're going to have to use nuclear power. And if we don't, we're just going to make life so hard that it won't happen. We won't succeed. We must use nuclear power. It's generally safe. And the new technologies that are already coming about and are being developed will make it cheaper and safer still. And it's something we must invest in. So nuclear, yes, fusion, forget about, but nuclear power, fission reactors, those are things that we have to be spending money on. We have to plan to invest in, and we have to rely on. What Germany did, deciding to get rid of it, shut down its nuclear reactors, was stupid. And the result is they're using more coal than they would have had to otherwise. This was a terrible, stupid decision. I still can't figure out why they're sticking to it now with what's going on in Ukraine and the incredible increase in the price of oil and gas. Shutting down nuclear reactors that were operating perfectly makes no sense. It's a shame that this has happened. So we're going to have to rely much more on nuclear power, not fusion, but traditional nuclear fission power.
Okay, thank you. Another question is exactly about Ukraine war, which is your opinion about this problem related to the energy security, energy dependence of European Union, especially obviously on European Union, which is, can I say, your opinion about the situation. So, as you said, at the moment, today, the stream, so the pipe for the gas import in Germany stopped because of some problem related to maintenance of the pipeline. We don't know if we will be able to restart the production. 1/3 of our total import from Russia stopped from Gazprom, and so Europe at the moment is in a big crisis. So this is related to, so the big picture is very complicated because we have energy security. So the first question is on this. After I have another one more wider on the problem related to stagflation. So which is your opinion about the situation in Europe and the next month?
Well, the next month, I think prices will continue to stay high, gas, oil, and there's very little that can be done. I think Europe has to begin figuring out how to reduce its dependence on natural gas and oil. It's that simple. Again, shutting down nuclear plants is absolutely the opposite of what they should be doing. So, if they can restart those nuclear plants, that would be a good thing to do in the next month or next 6 months or next year. But the fact is that prices will be high. There may have to be rationing. People don't like that. They like to drive their cars. They like to heat their homes. They like to turn on the lights. They like to use energy. They don't like to be restricted. But this is life. It's going to be difficult. And it probably will get more difficult. So they should do whatever can be done now. Let's start with nuclear power at the very least.
Yeah, I understand. So it could be maybe an impulse in order to, to change in our case also the dependence. In our case, it's changing a little bit the dependence of Italy, for example, from Russia. We are starting to increase the import for Algeria, from Azerbaijan, because we discovered, but I have to say that is a problem that continues to exist in Italy, because I'm looking at some documents in 2018. We have had the same problem, more or less, due to a problem, accident in the pipeline from Russia. The last is related to so the macroeconomy. So the idea, if your opinion again. So I have in mind this point. So on the one hand, every time there is a crisis, unfortunately, the economical crises are increasing the frequency in the last years. The reaction of the macroeconomists is to increase the money supply. in order to, we discovered after 2008, 2011 in Europe, 2020 after COVID-19. And now there is a huge amount of money supply in the system. And this worked until the inflation was very low. At the moment, we have an inflation that is totally driven by the shortage of energy, so what I am able to see. And the problem is that, but at the same time, the central banks started to reduce the money supply in order to, on the one hand, control probably the inflation. On the other hand, probably because a huge amount of money can also create some bubbles. But it's my opinion. A lot of amount of money means a huge size of a financial system that can move and can create some, I can say, a totally difference with respect to the financial value of a firm and its real value. If I look at the Dow Jones level today, is higher than 2008 level. In 2008, we had a bubble. Today is another situation. So, looking at again the situation. So, we are in a situation in which inflation, war, probably also a recession, and the money supply that is very, very high. Which could be so for the future, the policy in order to control a probable recession, if, according to your opinion, we are going to a recession.
You're asking if we're going to have a recession coming in the next year or two?
Yeah, first question, yes. And which could be the solution from a political point of view? So which are money supply or policy? So which are the possible weapons for us?
So first of all, just a couple of things about inflation. So you said inflation in Europe is due entirely to energy, oil and gas. It's partly due to energy, but it's also due to increases in food prices that have nothing to do with energy, grain prices that have increased because of Ukraine, because of the war in part, and because of poor harvests in other parts of the world. So it's also due to increases in food prices, and it's also due to supply chain problems. For example, prices of cars, automobiles in the United States, in Europe, elsewhere, have risen in part because automakers cannot get the chips they need to produce the cars. So the result is that used cars are more valuable, prices go up, and new cars are in short supply, and their prices go up. So there are a number of reasons why we have inflation. In the United States, the stimulus spending has also been a cause. The stimulus spending on infrastructure and so on has also been a cause. In terms of what central banks can do, naturally they're going to try to cut back on the current amount of money that's in circulation. Interest rates are going to rise. Is this going to create a recession? I think that things will probably slow down relative to what they are today. I don't know whether we're going to actually see a recession, but we probably will see something in the way of a slowdown.
Okay, this is probably possible. So which could be the possible, so it's possible again to increase no, it's not possible to increase the money supply in order to push economy. So which could be the possible reaction of the system in order to reduce a possible, so for if in the future we will observe a new recession, which could be our weapons in terms of policymakers?
You mean, what should policymakers do if we do enter into a recession? I mean, I think what will happen if we enter in a recession is that, first of all, there could be monetary easing, moving in the other direction, depending on how severe the recession is. If it's a mild recession, we may not want to do anything because we may feel that reducing inflation is more important than reducing the impact on GDP in the short run. So it may be that we don't want to do anything. I think we have to see how things play out. I don't think it's possible right now to say, this is what should be done. The other thing is, in Europe, there's more of a social safety net than there is in the United States. So a recession in Europe is less harmful to people than it would be in the United States because of the safety net. I think in the United States, we have to do more to fix the social safety net so that if we enter into a recession, it won't be as devastating to lower income families as it would be otherwise.
Okay. Thank you very much, Robert. It was a pleasure and an honor to speak with you, and also for this our interview. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, and I hope you find the book, Climate Future, interesting to read.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.